All right, hi everyone. Welcome to this webinar on GHData, which is now known as Augur. I want to just go over a little bit about what GHData is and put it in the context of the CHAOS project for you. So as you know, CHAOS is a Linux Foundation project focused on collaboration for extracting knowledge from software development data. And our main aim is to keep track of the sustainability of these projects in different ways. So we need a common understanding of some kind of open source project health. And the aim is that the metrics themselves are agnostic. So how they're implemented, whether it's in Bitergia, Grimoire Lab, GHData/Augur, or other tools, that the metrics are defined in a consistent way so that whatever tools you're using, when we talk about, for example, commits or unique commits, that we're sure that we're talking about the same thing. CHAOS is a project that has a lot of partners, a lot of engagement from the open source community involved in Linux, the Linux Foundation and beyond. And for the software piece, and it looks like I did not get but for the software piece, Bitergia, University of Missouri, University of Nebraska, Omaha, and University of Victoria are the big contributors right now for software. We also have some partnerships with other metrics software providers. There's a metrics community, and let's see, software community. Okay, wait a minute. This is not the one that I thought it was, but okay. Well, anyway. Whoops, I don't know what happened here. Okay, so great webinar. Start new. Okay, I don't know what happened here. All right. Well, there we are. So we have a lot of folks involved in the metrics committee. Grimoire Lab is our main implementation. It has a lot of different data sources and a tool called Percival that allows the integration of data sources. And we're working to engage Percival in what is now called Augur, or GHData. It used to be called GHData. And GHData focuses on enabling comparisons, visual representations, and an API inside of its hosted version so that you can actually use the GHData Augur API to pull information from our hosted version of GHTorrent. And just to give you an overview of what is involved in GHData, when you come to the GHData/Augurs project, you have the opportunity to search on any combination of GitHub, organization, and project name. So here I've done a search on Rails, and it's been scoped from the very beginning. I can change that scope to start in 2015 and end in 2017. And you can see that down here, if I redo this search, it will show me those dates. And so, I don't know, it's not responding to my change right now for whatever reason. And so down here you can see these are the commits per week in GHData for the life of Rails, the forks, issues, issue comments, commit comments, pull request comments, acceptance rate, and issues closed. And I see we can also look at different factors. So these are what are called growth, maturity, and decline metrics. We can look at how the engagement of open source developers has changed on the Rails project over time. And down here you can we can see code engagement, basically who are the folks who are making the most commits, and what kind of the commit trajectories look like. So for code engagement, we can see the total number of commits and commit comments, and these are individuals represented in the circles. And these individuals can have different levels of engagement or contribution. So for example, if I pick this person, I can see that they've had a number of commits over here, and then they had a number of, and it's a little bit slow to respond this morning, similar number of issue comments over here. So there's code engagement and issue engagement, and we can just sort of see how people are engaging differently, and their total contributions are reflected in the size of the circle. We can also see issue activity over time, and you can see that Rails had a very large engagement at the very beginning, and it's smaller now. And we can also look at the ecosystem for a project, and that's essentially the downloads per day if that's available, and the stars per week if that's available. And if dependencies are available for a project, that is also shown here. Now, one of the features of GHData is it allows you to compare different projects with each other. So if I wanted to compare Rails with Cake PHP, I can do that. And what I'll see here is the 100% line is the level of commits per week averaged for Rails, and then I can see the relative difference for Cake PHP. So you can see in some cases Cake PHP's rate of commits per week is higher up through mid 2011, and then it declines, which probably indicates that the Cake PHP project relative to Rails is declining in engagement. And this is helpful because sometimes it's hard to know if an open source project is changing in a way that's meaningful. So for example, if I scroll back up here to just looking at Rails, and I see commits per week, you can see I've got some really spiky action here, but it looks pretty stable, a few ups and downs over time in commits per week. Same with forks, and it's really just showing a very steady level of contribution for the most part. Now, if I'm the owner of Rails, that might not mean something clear to me. And one way to get clarity is to compare your project with another one. So when I look at Rails and I compare it with Cake PHP, we can see the relative level of engagement on these projects is somewhat different. So for Rails, this steady line of contribution, which we see above, when compared to Cake PHP, shows that Cake PHP's engagement is actually declining in comparison to Rails. And so that might be an indication that the Rails project has a more stable level of growth, maturity, and decline compared with the others. And then down here, when this finishes painting, we can also see the level of code engagement and community engagement. So the Rails case is purple, and the participants in Cake PHP are in the red or the orange color, depending how that's showing up on your screen. And so we can see also the individual level of engagement on this project on these two projects is changing a bit, or has different strategies. Rails has people with more commits than Cake PHP in general. So that concludes my basic overview of what the GHData Augur project provides, and apparently my screen is repainting right now. Any questions?
Yes, and I have a question. In some cases, we have been talking about GHData as a way of prototyping metrics.
Mm-hmm.
What can you say about that? How difficult is to include a new metric, for instance, on what workflows?
It's a great question. So for including new metrics, you would come to the GHData repository, which we'll rename to Augur sometime soon. And there are two or three ways that you can go about creating new metrics. The first would be, let's say that you have a new metric that you want to create. You would look under the GHData directory, and all of the GHData directory contains one Python file, and this is explained in a developer contribution README as well, but it's got one Python file for each source of data that it uses. So for the GitHub API, there's this Python file. For GitHub, for GHTorrent, there's this one. So let's say, if, for example, I wanted to add a metric under the GHTorrent API, I would familiarize myself with the GHTorrent schema, and like you can see here right now, there's a single table by date. This generates a query to count occurrences of rows per date for a given table. And okay, and that's actually a general helper function. Let me go down. These are the basic time series queries. So if I wanted to, this is a Stargazer's query. And let's say that I wanted to create some new version of the Stargazer's query. I might copy this SQL and perhaps pass it some new parameters, repo ID and user ID. Perhaps I want to look at Stargazers by date or Stargazers over time. And so I would maybe change this. I would create a new function in here for Stargazers over time, or Stargazers. This is Stargazers by week. I'm trying to think of a new metric. Do you have a new metric in mind, Jesus?
No, whichever.
So essentially, you could just create a new function definition inside this Python file if it was based on GHTorrent. Mm-hmm. If you similarly, and I think this is maybe obvious to software developers, but less obvious to folks new to building software, if I wanted to create a GitHub API, a metric based on the GitHub API, I would come to the GitHub API Python file and make, add the new metric here, and then issue a pull request back. So the GitHub API, it's using the graph query language, and I don't know how familiar people are with that, but you can essentially pull a lot of information that's not in GHTorrent directly from the GitHub API, which we do in some cases. Mm-hmm. And then to make it visible, there are two ways that you could go ahead and visualize that new metric once you'd created it. The first way would be to look at anytime that you run the development version, there's an API that gets generated, and this API is actually available to anybody that's running it, but this is a public API that we're looking at right now. So, for example, for diversity, commits and location by user is a metric. You can actually build your own web app that calls into this API once you've built out your new metric, and build the visualization for the metric however you want. Another possibility, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Another possibility would be that you could actually go into our front end and make a new contribution to the visualizations in our front end. And we use what's called a brunch server. And under the brunch server, there's a number of files. Let's see, it's not there. It might be under app. So these are essentially JavaScript files that provide the visualization endpoints for data from the GHData, data from GitHub API, and then some other kinds of data that's included. So we could just edit this, and I'm not a JavaScript wizard, but we could essentially add a visualization to the front end here based on the new metric that you created. And for those of you familiar with JavaScript, we use the Vue JavaScript library, which you can see right here, right now.
And that means, if I understand well, that if you want to have a visualization which is of one kind that you already have, basically you only need to copy the code for the new metric. And
exactly. Yeah. So we have a lot of line visualizations and some bubble charts already deployed, and you could essentially take a look at. Let's see. Okay, so this is actually the main one. So this is these are some.
Yeah.
That's the bubble chart. So there's a set of dependencies and hierarchies in here, but essentially you could create a new. This is the view card for some of our issues per week.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I see. So basically, you need to create a new one, to have a new room, a new space in the web page.
Hold on. Okay. Apparently my dentist chose now to call. Yes, and there's also a contributing markdown file here,
Mm-hmm.
which essentially describes the simple process of cloning the repo and submitting a pull request, which is actually there's another markdown file. Maybe it's in the README. That's how to install it. And then, okay. I see we have a developer guide here that's referenced there. Should probably have that in the front page, but right now it's under docs. And it explains everything in here about creating a function in Python, dealing with the dependencies, adding tests, creating the endpoint function. And that's in the first document. And then part 2 is showing how to use Vue, metrics, graphics, and Cube for the front end. And this just explains the different parts and how to add a time series, for example, metric. So the adding a time series metric is actually pretty straightforward. You would create a time series. You just this line with whatever you created, your endpoint name is whatever you put into the Python file as the definition function name, and you just add that to GHData API.javascript. Okay, I'm sorry. Apparently I'm popular today. And then you add, you can add a chart here, and as long as the chart is one of the charts that already exists, it works just good. It works fine. And then you can add comparison functionality as well if you want to include this in the comparisons.
Nice.
And this will be renamed to Augur shortly. I don't want to rename it to Augur before I've got everyone coordinated around that, because it'll change a bunch of deploy stuff for us.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, and so one of the roadmap things that we have is adding new, for the Python files, we're going to add one for Percival at some point in the near future, and for other data providers. I think one of the functions that people have asked for is the ability to select a set of repositories so that you can compare maybe 50 repositories with each other at a more detailed level. So that's some of what we might do, and we might use Percival for that. So that's kind of what's happening with the Augur GHData project. And I think one thing to point out is a few companies are using this API just to prototype using their own visualization. So the provision of a API is helpful for people to get started. A lot of times organizations have their own way of putting front end things together, but they might be useful to have the back end API as well. I guess I have to go back. So other questions that folks have?
No, thank you from my side. Thank you very much for explaining it. Now I have a much more clear idea of how to work with it. So thank you very much.
No, thank you, Jesus. And I think we had a couple other people online. So anybody else that's online have any questions? All right. Well, thank you very much for participating in this webinar on GHData/Augur related to the Chaos project. We're going to do these webinars every week or two. And the next one is going to be focused on Grimoire Lab. And we'll probably, Jesus, do you know when will that happen next week or the week after?
Very likely next week. So
Next
I'm
week.
announcing on the mailing list.
Okay, so that'll be announced on the mailing list. Thank you all for participating, and I will see you online.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.